is approximately where she was found.
The 17-year-old high school junior stabbed more than a dozen times.
Find out who it was before I died.
Imagine leaving your door unlocked, letting your children play freely in the streets, and never thinking twice about walking home alone. That was life in Wahoo, Nebraska, a quiet town where everyone knew their neighbors, and the worst crime was usually nothing more than teenage mischief. It was March 1969, and spring was just beginning to soften winter's edge. But beneath this peaceful facade, something sinister was stirring. For 17-year-old Mary Kay Heese, March 25th started like any other day. She walked the familiar streets of her hometown, her school books clutched to her chest, perhaps thinking about homework, or what her mother might be cooking for dinner. But as dusk settled over Wahoo that evening, Mary Kay's empty chair at the dinner table would become the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt this community for decades. What happened in those crucial hours between Mary Kay's last known sighting and the grim discovery that followed? How could a young girl vanish from the streets of a town where everyone knew everyone else? And why would it take over 50 years for the truth to finally emerge from the shadows? This isn't just another small town murder story. It's a tale of shattered innocence, of a community forever changed, and of a family's relentless pursuit of justice. But most importantly, it's the story of Mary Kay Heese, a daughter, a student, a friend, whose life was cut tragically short on a spring evening that Wahoo, Nebraska would never forget.
He allegedly murdered my cousin, brutally, threw her in a ditch, and drove away.
To understand the magnitude of what was lost that March evening, you need to know Mary Kay Heese beyond the headlines that would later tell of her tragic end. She wasn't just another face in the hallways of Wahoo High School. She was the quiet force of kindness that made the ordinary extraordinary. Mary Kay's mother, Dorothy, often said her daughter was an old soul in a young body. At 17, while other teenagers were pushing boundaries, Mary Kay found joy in the simpler things. She was the daughter who'd help prepare Sunday dinners without being asked, the student who'd stay after class to help struggling classmates, and the friend who always seemed to know when someone needed a gentle word of encouragement. In the halls of Wahoo High, where she was a junior in 1969, Mary Kay wasn't part of the popular crowd, nor did she want to be. Her teachers remembered her as diligent and thoughtful, the kind of student who'd rather perfect an essay than gossip about the latest school drama. She had dreams of making a difference, though she kept them mostly to herself. Her notebooks, later found by investigators, were filled with not just schoolwork, but carefully written plans for the future. She was the responsible one, her classmates would later recall, the one you could always count on. That reliability became her trademark, whether it was volunteering at the local library or helping younger students with their homework. Mary Kay moved through life with a quiet grace that made her absence all the more devastating when it came. What no one knew at the time was that in the months before her death, Mary Kay had sensed something wasn't quite right. She never shared her concerns openly, but hints of unease would later be found in her private writings, subtle warnings that, in hindsight, took on a chilling significance. March 25th, 1969, dawned crisp and clear in Wahoo. Mary Kay rose early, as she always did, carefully selecting her outfit and packing her school books. Her mother, Dorothy, would later recall their last conversation over breakfast, ordinary words about ordinary things that would haunt her forever. The school day passed without incident. Mary Kay attended her classes, turned in her assignments, and made plans with a friend to study for an upcoming test. By late afternoon, she was seen walking near the intersection of 12th and Linden Streets, just 6 blocks from home. It was around 4:30 p.m., and the spring sun was still high enough to cast long shadows across the sidewalks. A neighbor noticed her familiar silhouette. Schoolbooks clutched close, her measured stride marking the familiar path she'd walked countless times before. But Mary Kay never made it home. As the hands of the kitchen clock crept past 5:30 p.m., Dorothy felt the first stirrings of worry. Her daughter was never late without calling. By 6:08 p.m., that worry had bloomed into fear. Calls to Mary Kay's friends yielded nothing. No one had seen her since school. As darkness fell over Wahoo, neighbors joined the increasingly frantic search, calling out her name into the growing night. Just after midnight, a passerby made the discovery that would change Wahoo forever. Along a desolate stretch of road south of town, partially concealed in a roadside ditch, lay Mary Kay's body. The scene told a story of unimaginable violence, multiple stab wounds marking a fierce struggle for life. Her schoolbooks lay scattered nearby, silent witnesses to her final moments. Law enforcement quickly cordoned off the area, but word spread through Wahoo like wildfire. Parents woke their children to check on them. Doors were locked. Phone lines buzzed with the terrible news. The sight of FBI agents arriving in their dark sedans the next morning confirmed what everyone already knew. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was the worst crime in Wahoo's history. The peaceful fabric of small-town life had been torn apart, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. They had never seen anything like this before. The investigation's numbers were staggering. Nearly 700 interviews conducted, dozens of potential suspects questioned, every square inch of the crime scene methodically searched. Yet each new lead seemed to evaporate as quickly as morning dew under the spring sun. The evidence painted a disturbing picture. Mary Kay had fought for her life. Defensive wounds on her hands proved that much. The multiple stab wounds suggested rage, perhaps even personal motivation. But the killer had been careful too. No murder weapon was ever found, and rain, in the hours after the discovery, had washed away crucial evidence. We're looking for someone who knew the area well, one FBI agent told reporters. The location where she was found wasn't somewhere you'd stumble upon by accident. This revelation sent shivers through the community. Could the killer be one of their own? Detectives worked around the clock, following every possible lead. They traced Mary Kay's final walk home, interviewing anyone who might have seen something unusual that afternoon. They investigated local troublemakers, drifters who'd passed through town, even people Mary Kay had mentioned in her diary. But each promising lead eventually hit a dead end. The most frustrating aspect for investigators was the timing. In broad daylight, on a route Mary Kay walked regularly, someone had managed to abduct and murder her without leaving behind a single reliable witness. How was that possible in a town where everyone knew everyone else? As weeks turned into months, the case began to cool. The FBI agents gradually withdrew, leaving behind boxes of interview transcripts and evidence files that would gather dust for decades. For Wahoo's residents, the lack of answers was almost as terrifying as the crime itself. If the killer wasn't caught, could it happen again? And worse still, was the murderer still walking among them? In the months following Mary Kay's murder, Wahoo underwent a transformation that went far deeper than the newly installed door locks and street lights. The town's innocence hadn't just been damaged, it had been shattered beyond repair. Parents who once let their children roam freely now enforced strict curfews. The simple act of walking home from school became an orchestrated operation, with groups of students moving together under watchful adult eyes. Neighbors who had never thought twice about leaving their doors unlocked now double-checked them obsessively. "We stopped being a town and started being suspects," recalled one longtime resident. Every lingering glance, every unexpected visitor, every unfamiliar car parked on the street became cause for suspicion. The murder had planted seeds of doubt that grew into thick walls of distrust. The high school halls where Mary Kay once walked became unnaturally quiet. Her empty desk served as a daily reminder of what had been lost. Teachers noticed their students growing up faster than they should have, forced to confront a darkness they weren't ready to understand. The Class of 70 yearbook would feature a memorial page for Mary Kay, a somber addition to what should have been a celebration of youth. Local businesses began closing earlier, especially during winter months, when darkness came sooner. The evening streets of Wahoo, once alive with the sound of children playing and neighbors chatting, fell silent. Even simple pleasures like evening walks became tainted by an undercurrent of fear. But perhaps the most profound change was invisible to the eye. It lived in the whispered conversations between parents, in the nervous glances exchanged when strangers passed through town, and in the unspoken question that haunted every resident: was the killer still among them? This uncertainty created a wound in Wahoo's community spirit that would take generations to heal.
I promised Aunt Dorothy that I would continue to press to find out who it was.
Time has a way of healing wounds, they say, but for Mary Kay's family, each passing year only deepened the mystery of her death. As Wahoo moved forward, Dorothy Heese watched her daughter's case slip further into the shadows of history. Files gathered dust in the police station basement. Witnesses' memories faded, and the trail grew colder with each passing season. But while others might have accepted the cruel silence of an unsolved case, Mary Kay's cousin, Kathy Tull, refused to let her memory fade. "I made a promise," Kathy would later say, her voice firm with conviction. "I promised Aunt Dorothy we wouldn't stop until we found the truth." Dorothy Heese passed away without knowing who took her daughter's life, carrying that burden of uncertainty to her grave. For Kathy, her aunt's death only strengthened her resolve. She became a constant presence at the police station, making regular calls to investigators and refusing to let Mary Kay become just another cold case number. The years ticked by, 10, 20, 30, then 40. New detectives inherited the case files, each bringing fresh eyes but reaching the same dead ends. Some suggested it was time to let go, that too much time had passed. But Kathy's response never wavered. Time doesn't change what happened to Mary Kay. Throughout those decades of silence, Kathy kept meticulous records. She collected newspaper clippings, gathered family photos, and documented every conversation with law enforcement. Her home became an unofficial archive of the case, boxes filled with the kind of details that investigators might have overlooked. "People thought I was obsessed," Kathy admitted years later. "Maybe I was, but someone had to keep Mary Kay's story alive. Someone had to keep fighting for her." After decades of silence, 2024 brought a cascade of developments that would finally crack open the case that had haunted Wahoo for over half a century. It began with the decision that even Kathy Tull struggled with: the exhumation of Mary Kay's body.
I cried. I was hoping I was doing the right thing, disrupting her. But we were at a point where if that was the only option we had, we needed to do it.
The exhumation, conducted under the watchful eyes of modern forensic experts, promised to unlock secrets that 1969's technology couldn't reveal. But fate had another card to play. While sorting through her late Aunt Dorothy's belongings, Kathy made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. There, tucked away in an old box, was Mary Kay's necklace.
You got all this out for me today, and in there you found this necklace.
Yep.
And this is the same one she was wearing in her pictures. Mm-hmm. Do you think she was wearing this necklace when she was murdered?
I think she was wearing it that night. I think that the mortuary probably released this to Aunt Dorothy afterwards, or somebody did, because her name's written on the bag.
More chilling still was what lay beneath it. A letter written by Mary Kay just months before her death. The words seemed to reach through time, carrying a warning no one had heeded.
We had a little trouble around our house. I haven't found out who it is yet, but I'm getting the information.
What trouble had Mary Kay sensed? What information had she been gathering?
I kept calling and calling and calling, wanting to know where the case was and if we had any new evidence. And then when we put the tip line up, and when we did that, it seems that things kind of took off.
The tip line Kathy had established years earlier suddenly crackled with new energy. People who had held their silence for decades finally began to speak. Perhaps it was guilt, or the realization that time was running out for justice to be served. Whatever the reason, the walls of silence began to crumble. Investigators, armed with modern DNA technology and these new leads, began piecing together a picture that had remained fragmented for over 50 years. The necklace, preserved in its paper tomb, yielded microscopic evidence that 1969's investigators couldn't have dreamed of finding. Mary Kay's letter provided context that transformed seemingly unrelated details into vital clues. It was like watching a photograph develop. One investigator would later say, every new piece of evidence made the picture clearer. They weren't just following a cold trail anymore. They were closing in on a killer who had walked free for far too long. As 2024 drew to a close, the investigation accelerated with an intensity that took even Kathy by surprise. Decades of dead ends were suddenly giving way to concrete leads. Justice, so long delayed, was finally within reach. On November 18th, 2024, in the quiet town of Ponca City, Oklahoma, time finally caught up with 77-year-old Joseph A. Ambrose. As U.S. Marshals moved in to make the arrest, they weren't just apprehending a suspect. They were closing a chapter that had remained open since 1969. The news of Ambrose's arrest hit Wahoo like a thunderbolt for a community that had lived with this unsolved crime for over 5 decades. The reality was almost too much to process. Here was a name, a face, an answer to the question that had haunted their town for generations. I was washing dishes when I got the call, Kathy Tull recalled, her voice breaking. My legs just gave out. After all these years, after all the dead ends and disappointments, we finally had him. The man accused of taking Mary Kay's life had been living quietly, perhaps thinking time had erased his tracks. As news crews descended on Wahoo, longtime residents struggled to reconcile their memories with this new reality. Many remembered 1969 as if it were yesterday. The fear, the searches, the candlelight vigils. Now, finally, there was a face to attach to those dark memories. The arrest sent shockwaves through both communities. In Ponca City, neighbors described Ambrose as unremarkable, someone who never drew attention to himself. In Wahoo, people struggled to remember if their paths had ever crossed with his. How had he managed to hide in plain sight for so long? For Kathy, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. I wish Aunt Dorothy could have lived to see this day, she said, touching the necklace that had helped break the case. She never gave up hope that someday, somehow, we'd find the person who took Mary Kay from us. As investigators began revealing details of the case against Ambrose, the portrait they painted was one of meticulous police work, combined with scientific breakthroughs. The evidence that had seemed insufficient in 1969 now told a compelling story through the lens of modern forensic technology. The discovery of Mary Kay's necklace had proven crucial, providing investigators with DNA evidence that had been preserved unknowingly for over 5 decades, combined with information from the tip line and Mary Kay's prophetic letter. Investigators had finally assembled the pieces of this tragic puzzle. Yet some questions remained unanswered. What was the connection between Ambrose and Mary Kay? What had driven him to commit such a horrific crime? And why had he chosen to remain so close to the scene of his alleged crime for all these years? As the case moved toward trial, these questions hung heavy over Wahoo, reminding everyone that even solved mysteries can leave lasting shadows. If you want to see more true crime stories like Mary Kay's, don't forget to like and subscribe.